In the unforgiving winter of 1882, rancher Thomas McKenna had lost everything: his cattle, his fortune, even his family. With only a worn blanket between him and the brutal Colorado cold, he faced his darkest hour alone in his crumbling cabin. But when a dying stranger appeared at his door in the middle of a blizzard, Thomas made a choice that would change not just his life, but the fate of an entire territory. Sometimes the smallest acts of mercy can unleash the most powerful forces of justice. Will one man's compassion in his darkest moment spark a miracle that defends an entire community? Stay with us as we uncover this extraordinary tale of sacrifice, honor, and the unexpected bonds that can form between strangers in the American frontier. The February wind howled through the Colorado Territory like a wounded beast, carrying with it the bitter promise of death. Thomas McKenna sat hunched by the dying embers of his fireplace, wrapped in the only blanket he had left, a threadbare wool covering that had once belonged to his late wife, Sarah. The fabric still carried the faint scent of her lavender soap, a ghost of better times that now seemed like another man's memories. At 43, Thomas looked like he'd lived twice that long. His weathered hands, scarred from years of ranch work, trembled as he fed the last of his broken chair legs to the fire. The flames licked hungrily at the wood, casting dancing shadows across the bare walls of what had once been a proud home. Now, it was little more than a shelter against the storm, 4 walls, and a leaking roof that offered scant protection from nature's fury. 3 months ago, Thomas had owned the largest cattle ranch in Eagle County. 200 head of prime Colorado beef, fertile grazing land stretching as far as the eye could see, and a reputation as one of the most successful ranchers in the territory. But the harsh winter had come early and stayed late, and with it came disaster after disaster. First, the unseasonable October blizzard that killed half his herd, then the bank foreclosure when he couldn't make his payments. Finally, the fever that took Sarah just as the snow began to fall in earnest. The irony wasn't lost on him. A man who had once commanded vast herds of cattle now had barely enough food to last the week. His stomach ached with the hollow pain of hunger, a sensation he hadn't experienced since his childhood as an orphan on the streets of Denver. The pantry held only a few cans of beans, some hardtack that had turned soft with moisture, and a small pouch of coffee grounds he was saving for the direst necessity. Outside, the blizzard raged with unprecedented fury. The wind screamed through the gaps in the cabin's walls, creating an eerie symphony that spoke of nature's indifference to human suffering. Snow piled against the windows, threatening to bury the small cabin entirely. Thomas had seen bad winters before, but nothing like this. It was as if the very heavens had declared war on everything living. He pulled the blanket tighter around his shoulders, feeling the worn spots where the fabric had begun to thin. This blanket represented more than warmth. It was his last connection to Sarah, his final possession of any real value, and quite literally, the difference between survival and freezing to death. The temperature inside the cabin couldn't be much above freezing, and without the blanket he wouldn't last the night. As he stared into the flickering flames, Thomas reflected on the choices that had brought him to this moment. He could have sold the ranch earlier, when the offers were still good. He could have moved back east, where Sarah had family who would have taken them in. But pride, that stubborn McKenna pride that his father had passed down like a curse, had kept him rooted to this land. A man doesn't run from his problems, his father used to say. He faces them head-on, come what may. Well, Thomas had faced his problems and they had crushed him utterly. The fire was beginning to die down again, and Thomas knew he'd have to make a choice soon. Burn more of his furniture, or let the cold seep deeper into the cabin. He was contemplating breaking apart his kitchen table when he heard something that made his blood freeze. 3 distinct knocks on his front door. For a moment, Thomas thought the wind was playing tricks on him. No one traveled in weather like this. No one could travel in weather like this. The nearest neighbor was 15 miles away, and the town of Eagle Creek was a full day's ride in good conditions. But then the knocks came again, weaker this time, barely audible over the howling wind. Thomas wrapped the blanket around himself like a cloak and shuffled to the door. His hand hesitated on the latch. Opening the door would let in a blast of Arctic air that might kill what little warmth remained in the cabin. But something in those knocks, something desperate and failing, compelled him forward. He lifted the latch and pulled the door open, immediately staggered by the wall of wind and snow that struck him. At first, he saw nothing but swirling white chaos. Then, Huddled against his doorframe, he made out a figure that barely looked human. The stranger was wrapped in what might have once been a buffalo robe, now frozen solid and caked with ice. Long black hair hung in frozen strands around a face that was blue with cold. The man's lips had turned purple, and his eyes, dark and sunken with exhaustion, looked up at Thomas with the glazed expression of someone hovering at death's threshold. "Please," the stranger whispered, his voice barely carrying over the wind. "Shelter." Thomas didn't hesitate. Whatever this man's story, whatever had brought him to this God-forsaken place in the middle of the worst blizzard in memory, he was a human being in desperate need. Thomas grabbed the stranger under his arms and hauled him into the cabin, kicking the door shut against the storm. The stranger collapsed immediately, his frozen buffalo robe cracking like armor as he hit the floor. Up close, Thomas could see that this was a Native American man, probably in his 30s, though the cold and exhaustion made it hard to tell. His clothes beneath the robe were well made but inadequate for this weather, beaded leather that spoke of craftsmanship and care, now soaked through and offering no protection against the killing cold. Thomas had no love for Indians, too many years of conflict, too many stories of raids and violence. But looking at this man, seeing the way his body shook with uncontrollable tremors, Thomas saw only another human being who would die without help. The stranger's breathing was shallow and ragged. His hands, visible where they poked out from the frozen robe, were white with frostbite. Thomas knew the signs. This man had maybe an hour before the cold claimed him permanently. Without a second thought, Thomas unwrapped his precious blanket from his own shoulders. The cold air of the cabin immediately bit into his bones, but he ignored it as he knelt beside the stranger and began to wrap the wool around the frozen man's body. "Easy now," Thomas murmured, his breath visible in the frigid air. "You're safe now." As the blanket settled around the stranger, Thomas realized what he had done. He had given away his only protection against the cold to save a man he didn't know, a man who by all rights should be his enemy. The rational part of his mind screamed that he had just signed his own death warrant. Without the blanket, he would freeze before morning. But as he looked at the stranger's face, saw the way the man's eyes flickered with the first hint of hope, Thomas felt something he hadn't experienced in months: purpose. For the first time since Sarah's death, he had acted not out of desperation or self-preservation, but out of simple human compassion. The stranger's lips moved, trying to form words. Thomas leaned closer, straining to hear over the wind. "Thank you," the man whispered in heavily accented English. "You save my life." Thomas nodded and moved to stoke the fire with the last of his broken furniture. As the flames grew higher, casting more warmth into the small space, he settled back against the wall and watched the stranger begin to recover. The man's breathing grew steadier, his color slowly returning to something resembling normal. Outside, the blizzard continued to rage, but inside the tiny cabin, two men who should have been enemies shared warmth and shelter. Thomas didn't know the stranger's name, didn't know what had brought him to this place, didn't know if they would both survive the night. What he did know was that he had made the right choice. Whatever happened next, he had chosen compassion over self-preservation, humanity over fear. As he shivered in the cold air, watching over his unexpected guest, Thomas McKenna felt more alive than he had in months. Dawn was still hours away, and with it would come consequences neither man could imagine. Thomas woke to silence. The absence of the wind's howling was so complete, so sudden, that for a moment he thought he might be dead. His body ached with cold, every joint stiff, every muscle cramped from a night spent shivering against the cabin wall. The fire had died to cold ashes hours ago, and his breath formed clouds in the frigid air. The stranger still slept, wrapped in Sarah's blanket, his breathing now deep and regular. Color had returned to his face, and the deathly pallor of the night before had given way to the natural bronze complexion of health. Thomas allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. His sacrifice had worked. The man would live. But as Thomas tried to stand, his legs buckled beneath him. The night without shelter had taken its toll. His fingers were numb and clumsy, his toes completely without feeling. He recognized the early signs of frostbite setting in, the same condition that had nearly claimed his guest. Without warmth soon, he would follow the same path toward death that he had rescued the stranger from. Struggling to his feet, Thomas made his way to the frosted window and scraped away enough ice to peer outside. What he saw took his breath away. The blizzard had passed, leaving behind a world transformed into pristine white perfection. Snow lay 3 feet deep across his property, sculpted by the wind into fantastic drifts and formations. The morning sun, just cresting the horizon, set the entire landscape ablaze with golden light that reflected off the snow like thousands of diamonds. It was beautiful beyond description and utterly deadly. Behind him, the stranger stirred. Thomas turned to see dark eyes opening, alert and intelligent, scanning the cabin with the quick assessment of someone accustomed to potential danger. When those eyes settled on Thomas, they widened with surprise and something that might have been shame. "You are cold," the stranger said, his English clearer now that exhaustion wasn't claiming his voice. He began to unwrap the blanket from his shoulders. "This is yours. Keep it," Thomas said quickly, though his teeth chattered as he spoke. "You still need it more than I do." The stranger studied Thomas for a long moment, taking in his obvious discomfort, the way he hugged his arms around his chest for warmth, the slight blue tinge to his lips. Slowly he stood, keeping the blanket around his shoulders but opening it wide. "We share," he said simply. "Both live or both die." There was something in the man's tone, a quiet dignity mixed with absolute determination that brooked no argument. Thomas found himself moving toward the stranger, accepting half of the blanket as they sat together by the cold fireplace. The shared warmth was immediately noticeable, and Thomas felt the painful tingling that meant circulation was returning to his extremities. "I am Joseph Crow Feather," the stranger said, "of the Northern Cheyenne." "Thomas McKenna," Thomas replied, "and this was my ranch." Joseph nodded, his eyes taking in the bare walls, the broken furniture now reduced to ash, the general air of a man who had lost everything. "You gave me your last blanket," he said. It wasn't a question. Thomas didn't answer directly. Instead, he asked, "What brought you out in that storm? No one travels in weather like that." Joseph's face grew grave. "My daughter," he said simply. "She is sick, very sick. The medicine man says she will die without the white man's medicine. I was riding to Eagle Creek to the doctor there. In that blizzard, that's suicide. Better to die trying than to watch her suffer." Joseph's voice carried the weight of desperate love that any father would recognize, but the storm was worse than I expected. "My horse, he fell through ice, broke his leg. I had to leave him. I walked for 2 days before I found your cabin." Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. 2 days? In that storm? "I would walk 20 days if it would save her." The simple statement hung in the air between them, carrying more weight than any elaborate oath. Thomas found himself looking at this man with new eyes. Not an Indian, not an enemy, but a father driven by love for his child. A man who had risked everything, just as Thomas once had for his ranch, just as he would have for Sarah if he'd had the chance. "How old is she?" Thomas asked. 7 winters. Joseph's voice softened. "Her name is Morning Star. She has her mother's eyes bright as summer sky. 3 days ago the fever came. Now she burns like fire, but cannot wake." Thomas knew that fever. He'd seen it before, in the settlements and sometimes among his own men. Without proper medicine, quinine if they could get it, children rarely survived. The nearest doctor was indeed in Eagle Creek, but that was still a day's hard ride through snow that would be impossible to navigate on foot. "I have no horse to give you," Thomas said quietly. "Lost them all to the bank." Joseph nodded, unsurprised. "I will continue on foot. The storm has passed. You'll die out there. That snow is 3 feet deep, and more storms are coming. Then I die trying to save my daughter. This is what fathers do." Thomas stared into the cold fireplace, thinking of Sarah, thinking of the children they'd never had, thinking of chances not taken and words not said. When he looked up, his decision was made. "I'll come with you." Joseph stared at him in shock. "Why?" "She is not your daughter. We are not your people." "Maybe not," Thomas said, "but you're not walking to your death alone. Not after I just saved your life. You have no obligation." "I have every obligation." Thomas's voice was firm. "You shared your blanket. That makes us partners in survival." Before Joseph could respond, they both heard it. A sound that made no sense. A sound that shouldn't exist in this frozen wilderness. It was distant but growing closer. The thunder of hoofbeats, dozens of them moving fast across the snow. Thomas struggled to his feet and peered out the window again, What he saw made his blood freeze in his veins. Riders were approaching his cabin, not a few, but what looked like an army. They moved in formation across the white landscape, their horses' breath creating clouds of steam in the cold air. As they drew closer, Thomas could make out details that made his situation clear: war paint, feathers, traditional weapons alongside modern rifles. "Joseph," Thomas said, his voice tight with tension, "I think your people are looking for you." Joseph rose and looked out the window, his face immediately transforming. Where before there had been exhaustion and worry, now there was surprise mixed with something like awe. "How many riders?" he asked. Thomas counted quickly. "Maybe 300, maybe more." 300, Joseph whispered, and for the first time since Thomas had met him, the stoic mask slipped entirely. "They sent 300 warriors to find you, to find their war chief's son." Thomas turned slowly to stare at Joseph. "War chief's son?" Joseph nodded, his eyes still fixed on the approaching riders. "My father is Chief Standing Bear of the Northern Cheyenne. I am his eldest son, his heir, the one who will lead the people when he passes to the spirit world." The thundering of hooves was getting louder. Thomas could now see individual riders, painted faces, weapons glinting in the morning sun. An army was approaching his cabin, and he had spent the night harboring their chief's son. "They think I am dead," Joseph continued. "When the storm came and I did not return, my father must have sent every warrior in the tribe to search for me. And now they've found you," Thomas said, "in the cabin of a white rancher." The implication hung heavy between them. Thomas knew the stories, had heard the tales of what happened to white settlers found with captured Indians, or Indians found with white captors. The situation was ripe for misunderstanding, for violence, for bloodshed. "I will tell them the truth," Joseph said, "that you saved my life. Will they believe you?" Joseph looked at Thomas, this white man who had given up his only protection against death to save a stranger, who had offered to walk to certain death to help save a child he'd never met. "They will believe," he said, "because it is true." The riders were close now, close enough that Thomas could see the war paint on their faces, the grim determination in their eyes. They had been searching for their chief's son for days, expecting to find a body. Instead, they would find him alive, in the cabin of a white man they'd never met. What happened in the next few minutes would determine whether this story ended in bloodshed or something else entirely. Thomas straightened his shoulders, still sharing the blanket with Joseph, and prepared to meet 300 Cheyenne warriors with nothing but the truth and hope that honor still meant something in this harsh land. The thunder of hooves was almost upon them now. The sound of 300 horses coming to a halt outside his cabin was unlike anything Thomas had ever experienced. It wasn't just the thunder of hooves. It was the creak of leather, the snorting of animals, the jingle of weapons and ornaments, and underneath it all, the electric tension of men prepared for war, who had suddenly found their missing prince alive. Thomas stood beside Joseph at the cabin door, the blanket still shared between them, and watched as what looked like the entire fighting force of the Northern Cheyenne Nation arranged itself in a wide semicircle around his humble home. Warriors sat tall on painted ponies, their faces marked with the ceremonial paint of a war party, rifles and traditional weapons at ready. Steam rose from their horses' flanks, evidence of hard riding through the deep snow. At the center of the formation, an imposing figure rode forward on a magnificent black stallion. Even at a distance, the family resemblance was unmistakable. This had to be Chief Standing Bear, Joseph's father. He was a man in his 60s, his long hair streaked with silver, his face marked by decades of leadership and hard decisions. He wore the full regalia of a war chief, an eagle feather headdress, beaded buckskin decorated with symbols of his achievements, and around his neck, a choker made of bear claws that spoke of personal courage. But it was his eyes that commanded attention, dark, intelligent, and filled with the relief of a father who had prepared himself to find his son's frozen corpse, and instead found him alive. "My son," Standing Bear called out in Cheyenne, his voice carrying clearly across the snow. "We feared the winter spirits had claimed you." Joseph stepped forward, still keeping the blanket around both himself and Thomas. "Father, I live because of this man's kindness. The white rancher Thomas McKenna gave me his only blanket and shelter when I was dying from the cold. A murmur ran through the assembled warriors. Thomas didn't understand the words, but he could read the tone: surprise, suspicion, curiosity. Several of the younger warriors fingered their weapons, their eyes fixed on Thomas with expressions that weren't entirely friendly. Standing Bear's gaze shifted to Thomas, studying him with the intensity of a man who had spent his life judging character quickly and accurately. Thomas met that gaze steadily, despite the intimidating sight of hundreds of armed warriors surrounding his home. "You are Thomas McKenna," the chief said, in accented but clear English. "I am. My son says you saved his life. Any man would have done the same." Standing Bear's weathered face cracked into what might have been the beginning of a smile. "You think so? In my experience, few men risk their own lives for strangers. Fewer still risk them for enemies." "I didn't see an enemy," Thomas replied. "I saw a man dying from cold." This answer seemed to please Standing Bear. He dismounted from his horse with the fluid grace of a lifelong rider and walked toward the cabin. As he approached, Thomas could see the toll that the last few days had taken on him, the lines of worry around his eyes, the exhaustion that came from sleepless nights of searching. "Joseph tells me he was traveling to the white man's town for medicine," Standing Bear said. "For his daughter." "Yes, he said she has fever." Standing Bear's expression grew grave. "Morning Star is the light of our tribe. If she dies—" He didn't finish the sentence, but Thomas could read the implication. The loss of the chief's granddaughter would be a devastating blow to the entire nation. "The medicine she needs," Thomas said carefully. "It's in Eagle Creek, but that's still a day's ride, and more storms are coming." "You know of this medicine?" Thomas nodded. "Quinine. It's what the doctors use for that kind of fever. My wife—" He paused, the memory still painful. "My wife died from fever too. If we'd had quinine, she might have lived." Standing Bear studied Thomas with new interest. "Oh, you have lost much." "Everything," Thomas admitted. "But that's not important now. What matters is getting medicine to your granddaughter. The snow is deep. My son's horse is dead. How does one reach this town?" Thomas took a deep breath, knowing his next words would change everything. "I know these mountains better than anyone. I can guide a small party through the passes, even in snow this deep. We could reach Eagle Creek by nightfall." A buzz of conversation swept through the assembled warriors. Several spoke sharply in Cheyenne, their tone clearly objections. Thomas caught Joseph's eye and saw both gratitude and concern. Standing Bear held up a hand for silence. "You would do this? Guide Cheyenne warriors to the white man's town? Risk their suspicion, their anger? To save a child's life?" "Yes." The chief was quiet for a long moment, his eyes never leaving Thomas's face. Around them, 300 warriors waited for their leader's decision. The morning sun climbed higher, melting the edges of the snow and reminding everyone that time was precious. "There is something you should know," Standing Bear said finally. "The white settlements have been on edge lately. Rumors of war, fears of raiding parties. If they see Cheyenne warriors approaching their town, they'll assume the worst," Thomas finished. "There could be shooting. Many could die. My warriors, your people, and in the confusion no medicine would be obtained." Thomas felt the weight of the situation settling on his shoulders. 300 Cheyenne warriors couldn't approach Eagle Creek without triggering panic and potentially violence. But a small party might be seen as even more suspicious. And somewhere a 7-year-old girl was dying while they debated logistics. "What if," Thomas said slowly, "what if it wasn't Cheyenne warriors who went to town?" Standing Bear raised an eyebrow. "Explain. What if it was just a white rancher down on his luck, going to town to see the doctor? Someone who wouldn't attract attention, who could buy medicine and return. You would go alone?" "Not alone," Thomas said, glancing at Joseph. "With your son. He knows exactly what medicine is needed, and he has a right to be there when help arrives for his daughter." The murmur from the warriors grew louder, more agitated. Several voices rose in clear objection, and Thomas caught enough words to understand they were questioning the wisdom of trusting their future chief to a white stranger. Standing, Bear silenced them with a sharp gesture. "My warriors say you are unknown to us, that you could lead my son into a trap or sell him to your army." "They're right to be cautious," Thomas said. "I am a stranger to you, but Joseph isn't a stranger to me anymore. He shared his blanket with me this morning, just as I shared mine with him last night. That makes us brothers in survival." Joseph stepped forward, the blanket still around both their shoulders. "Father, this man speaks truth. When I was dying, he gave me his only protection against the cold, knowing it might cost him his life. He has already proven his honor." Standing Bear looked at the two men sharing the worn woolen blanket, his son, the next war chief of the Northern Cheyenne, and a white rancher who had lost everything but his compassion. In that shared blanket, he saw something that transcended the racial tensions and historical grievances that had defined relations between their peoples. "If I allow this," Standing Bear said slowly, "if I trust my son's life to your guidance, what do you ask in return?" Thomas was quiet for a moment, thinking. What did he want? His ranch was gone, his cattle dead, his wife buried. He had nothing left to lose and nothing to gain. But as he looked at the assembled warriors, at Joseph standing beside him, at the desperate hope in a father's and grandfather's eyes, he realized he did want something. "I want to help save a little girl's life," he said simply. "That's payment enough." Standing Bear studied him for a long moment, then turned to address his warriors in rapid Cheyenne. The discussion was animated, with several clear voices of dissent, but gradually the tone shifted. When the chief turned back to Thomas, his decision was clear. "We will trust you, Thomas McKenna, but know this, if harm comes to my son through treachery or carelessness, there is nowhere in this territory you could hide from my warrior's vengeance. And if he returns safely with medicine to save his daughter, then you will have earned the eternal friendship of the Northern Cheyenne Nation." Thomas nodded solemnly. "That's a bargain I'm willing to make." As if summoned by their conversation, two warriors approached leading horses, not the war ponies of the assembled army, but sturdy mountain horses equipped for travel through snow. These animals were fresh, well-fed, and ready for the hard journey ahead. "We leave now," Joseph said, preparing to mount. "Every moment we delay, Morning Star grows weaker." Thomas took one last look at his cabin, at the assembled warriors, at the surreal scene of his humble home surrounded by what looked like an army from another century. Then he climbed onto the horse provided for him and settled into the familiar comfort of the saddle. As they prepared to ride out, Standing Bear approached Thomas's horse and placed a weathered hand on the animal's neck. "May the spirits guide your path, and may you return before the next sunset with hope for our little star," he said solemnly. Thomas touched the brim of his hat in acknowledgement. "We'll bring back medicine, Chief. That's a promise." As they rode away from the cabin, heading toward the mountain pass that would take them to Eagle Creek, Thomas felt the eyes of 300 warriors watching them go. Behind them, an entire nation waited for the safe return of their future chief and the medicine that might save their beloved Morning Star. The stakes couldn't be higher, and the clock was ticking. The ride to Eagle Creek tested every skill Thomas had learned in 20 years of mountain living. The snow lay treacherous and deep, hiding fallen logs and rocky outcroppings that could cripple a horse with a single misstep. The mountain passes, normally challenging in good weather, had become narrow corridors of white death where one wrong turn could trigger an avalanche or lead them over a cliff disguised by snow. But Thomas knew these mountains like a man knows his own heartbeat. Every ridge, every valley, every shortcut and game trail had been mapped in his memory through decades of ranching in this harsh country. He led Joseph through passes that didn't appear on any white man's map, across frozen streams where the ice was thick enough to bear their weight, and down steep descents where their horses slid more than walked. Joseph rode beside him in focused silence, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon for signs of weather change. Every hour they delayed was an hour closer to death for his daughter, and that knowledge drove him forward, despite exhaustion, despite the treacherous conditions, despite the very real possibility that they might not survive the return journey. As they crested the final ridge before Eagle Creek, the town spread out below them like a collection of toy buildings scattered in the snow. Smoke rose from chimneys in lazy spirals, speaking of warm fires and comfortable homes. It was a peaceful scene that belied the racial tensions Thomas knew simmered beneath the surface of frontier life. "Remember," Thomas said as they approached the outskirts of town, "you're my hired hand. We've been trapped by the storm for days, and now we're finally able to reach the doctor for medicine. Keep your head down, speak little, and let me do the talking." Joseph nodded, pulling his hat lower over his distinctive features and wrapping his coat higher around his neck. To casual observation, he might pass for a half-breed or even a dark-complexioned white man. But if anyone looked closely, if anyone recognized the bearing of a Cheyenne warrior, their mission could end in violence. Eagle Creek's main street was nearly deserted, with only a few hardy souls venturing out in the post-storm cold. Thomas guided them directly to Dr. Harrison's office, a small building marked by a simple wooden sign. As they tied their horses to the hitching post, Thomas noticed curtains twitching in nearby windows. Their arrival had been noted. Dr. Harrison was a thin, nervous man in his 50s who had come west for his health and stayed because the frontier needed medical men willing to work for whatever payment they could get. He greeted Thomas with surprised recognition. "Tom McKenna, heard you'd lost the ranch. Sorry about Sarah, too. Terrible shame." The doctor's eyes shifted curiously to Joseph. "And who might this be?" "My hired man, Joe Crow," Thomas said smoothly. "We've been snowed in for days, but we need medicine urgently. There's a child, very sick with fever. High temperature, can't wake up. Burning hot, but shivering. We need quinine if you have it." Dr. Harrison frowned. "Whose child? Anyone I know?" Thomas had prepared for this question. "Family passing through. Got caught in the storm, same as us. Been sheltering in one of the old line shacks up in the mountains. The little girl took sick 3 days ago. Sounds like typhoid fever," Harrison mused. "Quinine might help, but she needs to be brought here for proper treatment." "Can't move her," Thomas said firmly. "Too sick, and the roads are too dangerous. We need medicine we can take back." The doctor studied both men carefully. Something in their intensity, their obvious desperation, convinced him not to ask more questions. "I have quinine powder, but it's expensive. $20 for enough to treat a child." $20 was a fortune, more money than Thomas had seen in months. But before he could speak, Joseph stepped forward and placed a small leather pouch on the doctor's desk. When Harrison opened it, he found gold nuggets worth far more than the requested payment. "Take what you need," Joseph said quietly. "The child's life is worth any price." Dr. Harrison prepared the medicine carefully, measuring out precise doses and explaining the dosage. As he worked, he glanced occasionally at Joseph, his expression growing more thoughtful. There was something about the man's bearing, his quiet dignity, that suggested more than a simple hired hand. "This Joe Crow," Harrison said casually. "Unusual name. Indian ancestry, perhaps." Thomas felt his heart skip, but Joseph answered calmly. "My grandmother was Cherokee. Long time ago." "Ah." Harrison seemed satisfied with this explanation. "Well, Cherokee were always peaceful folk. Not like those Cheyenne up north. Been hearing rumors they're stirring up trouble. War parties moving through the territory." Thomas and Joseph exchanged quick glances. "War parties?" Thomas asked. "So they say. Big group spotted north of here yesterday. Hundreds of warriors, all painted for battle. Got folks pretty nervous." Harrison finished wrapping the medicine. Course, could just be rumors. Frontier folk do love their scary stories. As they prepared to leave, Thomas noticed a group of men gathering across the street. Their body language was tense, suspicious, and their eyes were fixed on Joseph with uncomfortable intensity. One of them, a large man with a sheriff's badge, started walking toward the doctor's office. "Time to go," Thomas murmured. They mounted their horses quickly, but the sheriff reached them before they could ride away. "Hold up there, McKenna," Sheriff Williams called. "Need to ask you boys a few questions." Thomas forced himself to remain calm. "What can I help you with, Sheriff?" Williams was studying Joseph with the keen eye of a lawman who had survived on the frontier by being suspicious of everything. "Been hearing reports of Indian war parties in the area. Just want to make sure you boys haven't seen anything unusual." "Just trying to get medicine for a sick child, Sheriff," Thomas replied. "Haven't seen anyone but ourselves for days." "This your hired man?" Williams gestured toward Joseph. "That's right, Joe Crow, good worker." The sheriff walked around Joseph's horse, examining him from different angles. "You look familiar, Joe. Sure we haven't met before?" Joseph kept his eyes down, his voice low. "Don't think so, sir. I stay pretty close to Mr. McKenna's ranch." Williams wasn't convinced. "What ranch would that be?" Heard McKenna lost his spread to the bank. Thomas felt sweat forming despite the cold. "Working as caretaker now, Sheriff. Bank needs someone to watch the property." The lie was thin and Williams clearly suspected something, But before he could ask more questions, one of the men from across the street called out, "Sheriff, rider coming in fast from the north." Everyone turned to see a lone horseman galloping down the main street, his horse lathered with sweat despite the cold. The man slid to a stop near their group and practically fell from his saddle. "Sheriff!" he gasped. "Indian war party. Hundreds of them camped just 15 miles north of here. They got the whole area surrounded." The words hit the gathered crowd like a physical blow. Women screamed from nearby windows, men reached for weapons, and the general atmosphere of a peaceful mountain town transformed instantly into barely controlled panic. Sheriff Williams drew his gun, his eyes immediately snapping back to Joseph with deadly suspicion. "Well, well, well," he said slowly. "Indian war party to the north, and here I got myself a suspicious-looking half-breed right in my own town." Thomas felt the situation spiraling toward disaster. Around them, more armed townspeople were gathering, their faces showing the fear and hatred that had been building for generations. Joseph sat perfectly still on his horse, but Thomas could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hand moved almost imperceptibly toward the knife at his belt. "Sheriff," Thomas said carefully, "Joe here has been working for me for months. He's got nothing to do with any war party." "Is that so?" Williams kept his gun pointed at Joseph. "Then you won't mind if we hold him for questioning? Just to be safe, you understand." Thomas knew what frontier justice looked like. Joseph would disappear into the town jail, and by morning there might be nothing left of him but a burned cell and the claim that he had tried to escape. Meanwhile, Morningstar would die without her medicine, and Standing Bear would assume Thomas had betrayed them. The result would be a war that could consume the entire territory. "I'm afraid I can't let you do that, Sheriff," Thomas said quietly. Williams turned his gun toward Thomas. "You choosing sides here, McKenna? Your own people or some Indian?" "I'm choosing the side of a sick little girl who needs medicine," Thomas replied. "And I'm choosing the side of right." The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. 24 armed townspeople faced 2 men on horseback, and everyone knew that the next few seconds would determine whether this ended in conversation or bloodshed. Then Joseph spoke, his voice carrying clearly in the cold air. "I am Joseph Crowfeather," he said, straightening in his saddle with the bearing of the war chief he was destined to become. "Son of Standing Bear of the Northern Cheyenne. The warriors you speak of are not a war party. They are a search party looking for me." The crowd gasped and stepped back. Several guns were raised, hammers cocked back. Sheriff Williams's face went white with the realization that he was facing not just any Indian, but Cheyenne royalty. "You're Standing Bear's son?" Williams breathed. "The war chief's heir?" "I am. And I am here not for war, but for mercy. My daughter lies dying of fever, and this man," he gestured toward Thomas, "this white man who owes me nothing has risked his life to help me get medicine for her." "Lies!" someone shouted from the crowd. "Indians don't have white friends." "This one does," Joseph replied calmly. "Yesterday I was dying in a blizzard. Thomas McKenna found me at his door, and without hesitation he gave me his only blanket, his only protection against the cold. He shared his fire, his shelter, his food. When he learned of my daughter's sickness, he volunteered to guide me here through mountains that would kill most men." Thomas watched the faces in the crowd, seeing confusion replace simple hatred. This wasn't the story they expected to hear. Joseph continued, his voice growing stronger. "My father sent 300 warriors to find me, yes, but they wait peacefully where we left them. They have no quarrel with your town, no desire for war. They wait only for my return with medicine for a dying child." "How do we know this isn't some trick?" Sheriff Williams demanded, though his gun had lowered slightly. "Because," Thomas said, finding his voice again, "Joseph could have taken the medicine and run. He could have left me behind, ridden back to his people, and told them I betrayed him. Instead, he's standing here telling you the truth, even though it puts him in danger. Doctor." Harrison stepped forward from his office doorway, where he'd been listening to the entire exchange. "I've been practicing medicine for 20 years, he said. "I've seen men lie about many things, but never about a dying child. Not with the desperation I saw in this man's eyes." The crowd was wavering, torn between generations of fear and the compelling story they were hearing. Then a woman's voice called out from the crowd, "Let me see him." Everyone turned to see elderly Mrs. Patterson pushing through the crowd. She was the town's schoolteacher, a woman respected by everyone for her wisdom and fairness. She walked directly up to Joseph's horse and looked up at him with sharp, intelligent eyes. "You say you have a daughter," she said. "Tell me about her." Joseph's stern expression softened instantly. "Her name is Morning Star. She has 7 winters. She loves to ride horses and makes dolls from corn husks for the other children. She laughs like wind chimes, and when she sleeps she curls up like a kitten." His voice broke slightly. "3 days ago she could not wake from fever dreams, and she burns with heat, but shakes with cold." Mrs. Patterson studied his face for a long moment, reading the truth that only a parent's love could write. Finally, she turned to address the crowd. "This man is not lying," she said firmly. "I've taught children for 30 years, and I know what a father's love looks like. There is a little girl somewhere who needs our help." The crowd was silent, processing this unexpected turn. Then Sheriff Williams made his decision. "All right," he said, holstering his weapon. "You can go, but I'm sending riders to verify your story. If those warriors are anything but peaceful, if this is some kind of trap—" "It is not," Joseph said simply. "We seek only to save a child's life." As they prepared to leave town, Dr. Harrison approached with a larger bag of medicine. "Extra supplies," he explained, "and some instructions written down. If the fever is as bad as you describe, she'll need careful attention." Thomas and Joseph mounted their horses and rode slowly through the crowd, which parted reluctantly before them. As they reached the edge of town, Thomas could hear the arguments beginning behind them, some calling the sheriff a fool, others defending his decision to let them go. But they were free. They had the medicine, and time was running out. The ride back to the cabin was a race against both weather and time. Dark clouds were building on the horizon, promising another storm, and somewhere ahead, Morning Star was slipping closer to death with each passing hour. As they crested the final ridge and saw the cabin below, surrounded by the patient circle of Cheyenne warriors, Thomas felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. They had succeeded in their mission, but the real test was yet to come. Would the medicine be enough? Would they be in time? And what would happen next between a white rancher who had lost everything and a Native American nation that owed him a debt that could never be fully repaid? Standing Bear rode out to meet them, his face a mask of controlled hope and desperate fear. "Do you have it?" he asked simply. Joseph held up the medicine bag. "We have it, Father. Dr. Harrison's best quinine and instructions for its use." "Then let us ride like the wind," Standing Bear declared. "Morning Star waits and the spirits grow impatient." As the entire war party wheeled their horses toward home, Thomas found himself riding beside warriors who had been strangers that morning, but were now something approaching allies. The medicine bounced in his saddlebags, precious as gold, carrying the hopes of an entire nation. Behind them, Eagle Creek settled back into its routine, forever changed by the story of a white rancher and a Cheyenne war chief's son who had proven that honor and compassion could bridge any divide. But ahead lay the most important moment of all, the bedside of a little girl whose life hung in the balance, waiting to see if 2 men from different worlds could deliver the miracle she desperately needed. The race was almost over, but the stakes had never been higher.